Well, hello. We come to our third discussion about the second psalm. And as we have been saying, it is a psalm about Jesus Christ. This is not my own private interpretation. This is the interpretation of the Bible itself. For the psalm is quoted in the New Testament by the inspired writers who point us to its text and say this is concerning Jesus, his deity, his resurrection. As we look at the psalm, we have looked first at the first 6 verses in which we have prophetically given to us the message of the cross and the triumph of God at the cross. The nations conspire against God and against his anointed, that would be Jesus Christ, and they crucified him. But God holds them in derision, he laughs, and Jesus is raised from the dead. In our previous discussion, we looked specifically at verse 7, the message of the resurrection, and we discussed how the New Testament quotes that verse, Psalms 2 and verse 7. It's quoted in the book of Hebrews and elsewhere, and the New Testament says, again, this is about the resurrection of Jesus Christ. For this particular discussion, though, we're going to be looking at verses 7 through 12 in total and discussing what it has to do with us today. It's concerning Christ, the kingdom, and our response to Christ. Psalm 2, as we look at the structure, is split into 4 parts. In our English translations, each part is given 3 verses. So verses 1 through 3 discuss the rebellion against God, the conspiracy against God and against Christ. This would be the prophecy of the cross. Verses 4 through 6 talks about God's derision against this conspiracy. The nations cannot triumph against God, and so God raises Jesus from the dead and makes him to be king. Verses 7 through 9 then is going to give us the perspective of Jesus himself. As he looks at what God has done for him, he speaks to God, or rather, he speaks to us concerning what God has promised to him. And then finally, verses 10 through 12 is a direct admonition to us today to submit ourselves to Jesus Christ. And so we have these 4 parts. Let's go ahead and take a moment to read the entirety of Psalm 2. And as we read through it, pay attention to each one of the stanzas, if you will. Again, verses 1 through 3, 4 through 6, 7 through 9, and then 10 through 12. Psalm 2, beginning in verse 1. Why do the nations rage and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, let us burst their bonds apart and cast away their cords from us. He who sits in the heavens laughs. The Lord holds them in derision. Then he will speak to them in his wrath and terrify them in his fury, saying, as for me, I have set my king on Zion, my holy hill. I will tell of the decree. The Lord said to me, you are my son. Today I have begotten you. Ask of me, and I will make the nations your heritage, and the ends of the earth your possession. You shall break them with a rod of iron, and dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel. Now therefore, O kings, be wise. Be warned, O rulers of the earth. Serve the Lord with fear, and rejoice with trembling. Kiss the Son, lest he be angry, and you perish in the way, for his wrath is quickly kindled. Blessed are all those who take refuge in him. As we turn our attention to verses 7 through 9, we see a promise, or actually a series of promises made to Christ by God. As we consider these promises, we see, first of all, in verse 7, the promise of God to Christ that he would be the Son of God, that he would belong to God, that he would be God's child. The Lord said to me, you are my son, today I have begotten you. In verse 8, we have a promise that God will give Christ the world. Ask of me, and I will make the nations your heritage, and the ends of the earth your possession. And then finally, in verse 9, we have the promise that Christ will be the judge. You shall break them with a rod of iron and dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel. And so here we have three promises made to Christ by God, that he would be a son, he would be a king over all the earth, the King of Kings, and he would be the judge of the earth. Now, as we look at these promises, we can safely say that no monarch of ancient Israel ever had these promises fulfilled to them. Some, as they read the Psalms, try to make them entirely about the pre-Christian Israel, the Israel of the Old Testament. And yet, as we look at Psalms like these, it's clear that there is no one man other than Christ concerning whom this psalm can be said to have been fulfilled. And yet, in Christ, it is fulfilled perfectly. He was the Son of God. He was resurrected by God as a sign of his authority and sonship. He was given a kingdom which encompasses all of the earth. And we don't have to look into the future for this kingdom, for we have it now. The apostles took the gospel to all the world. They preached to every nation under heaven. And as they preached to all the world, the nations flooded into the church. And so even today, there are representatives from every nation in the kingdom. The nations have indeed come to Christ. Now, not all in the nations have submitted to Christ, but the kingdom of God, which is within us, spans the entire globe. Now, those who have not submitted to Christ, though, he has been appointed our judge. God, says the Apostle Paul, as he was speaking to the Areopagus, God has appointed a man to judge the world. And he's given proof of this to everyone by raising him from the dead. And so, this man, Jesus Christ, will one day dash the nations apart as with a rod of iron, as if they were a piece of pottery. The rod of verse 9 is a ruler's scepter. The scepter is not just a symbol of rulership. In ancient days, it was literally to symbolize a club, something that the ruler could use to, strike others. It was a symbol of authority and power, but it was also a weapon, both symbolically and sometimes quite literally. And so the rod of iron is a ruler's rod, a scepter. And Christ has all of that. And so, as we look at this psalm, we see the first three verses, prophecy of the cross. The next three verses, the prophecy of the resurrection. And then verses 7 through 9, the prophecy of the authority of Christ in his kingdom, that kingdom being the church, and the eventual judging of all of the world. Which then brings us to verses 10 through 12 of this psalm and the conclusion of the matter. Because this is a psalm that is very much telling us about Christ, but also telling us about the proper response to Christ. And if we think about this rationally, we have a God who sent his Son to the world, and the world conspired against his Son to kill that Son on a cross. But God is so powerful he could raise him from the dead. He has given that man, his Son, Jesus Christ, authority over all the world. Jesus says, Matthew 28 and verse 18, all authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. That means that he has authority over us today. One day he is going to judge the world, both the living and the dead. And the scriptures tell us that those who have sinned, who have rebelled against him and remained in that state of rebellion, will be cast into the lake of fire, which is the second death. And so we think about all of this and we ask ourselves, what is the rational, reasonable, logical response to such a situation? And the psalmist answers, you should be wise. You should be warned. You should serve the Lord with fear. rejoice with trembling. And as most English translations say, kiss the Son. Now that interpretation, that translation, kiss the Son, is sometimes heavily disputed as a translation, though I do note that, again, most of our English texts have used that rendering. The alternate reading, though, would be that we should receive instruction, that we should be willing to learn what Christ is wanting to teach us, or we should be loyal to him. Regardless, the meaning of the entirety of the text remains very clear. It is better to give in to Christ, to submit to Jesus now rather than later. If we submit to him now, then we will be a loyal servant. If we refuse to submit to him now, we will be an object of wrath. And so it's wise to submit to Jesus now. It is better to serve Jesus, recognizing that God is with him and the power of God is behind him, and we cannot fight against God. I'm reminded of the account of Abraham Lincoln, who once asked whether or not God was on the side of the Union or the Confederacy. He answered that he didn't so much care which side God was on. What he was wanting was to make sure he was on God's side. And that is more or less what this psalm is trying to tell us. We need to be on the side of Jesus. Don't worry about whether Jesus is on our side. Worry about whether you are serving him the way that he wants to be served. Because as we conclude the psalm, blessed are all who take refuge in him, we see that the wrath is mentioned, that he might be angry, you can perish when his wrath is quickly kindled. The alternative is blessings, joy, happiness. If we trust Jesus, if we make him our refuge and our place of security, we don't need to have any fear of the coming wrath. Rather, we can understand that he is wanting to take care of us. This psalm doesn't speak very broadly to that particular aspect of the character of Jesus, that he comes bringing blessings, that he comes bringing salvation. It more talks about the futility of rebelling against Jesus, that if we do fight against him, if we kick against the goads, as Jesus once described it to Saul of Tarsus on the road to Damascus, if we kick against the goads, if we fight against what Christ wants us to do, we are going to fail. He has the authority. We cannot win when we struggle against him. But the broader context of the scriptures, especially in the New Testament, make it clear that for those that do serve him, for those that do love him, Jesus brings salvation. He brings that security. He brings blessings. And the psalm touches upon this lightly. Blessed are all who take refuge in him. Just as we are to trust in God, we are to trust in Jesus. In fact, this is what Jesus says in John chapter 14. You believe in God, believe also in me. You have faith in God, have faith in the Son of God. You trust in the salvation of God, trust in the salvation of Christ. You trust in the promises of God, trust likewise in the promises of Christ. Because Christ is the Son of God. He is the anointed of God. He is the Messiah, the Christ. He is the firstborn from the dead. He is all that God has given to us for our salvation. And we can't do better than to put our trust in him. As we read through the psalm, again, we see a powerful predictive prophecy concerning the cross. But we also see an admonition to be wise and to submit ourselves to Christ now rather than be judged by him later. This was God's message to his people in the Old Testament as he was preparing them for the coming of Christ. And it's no less God's message to us today as we prepare ourselves to receive Christ into our lives and into our hearts. I hope that this study upon Psalms 2 has been of benefit to you. And until our next time together, God bless you and have a great day.